Welcome to Beyond Motion. We are going to have some fun today. In this episode, we are going to ask ChatGPT to come up with some biomechanics questions for us. And so very excited to give this a chance. We talked about this as a topic a few weeks ago, and so excited to kind of bring it to life. And seems like there's some fun and controversial topics that it decided to bring up. And so it'll be exciting to kind of go through those things.
Yeah, definitely.
Nice. So I guess we can just get right into it then. So first topic is injury prevention and performance enhancement. And the question just really starts with a banger. So should athletes be allowed to use biomechanical data to optimize performance, or does it give an unfair advantage? What do you think?
Yeah, honestly, I feel that as long as it's just data, you should be able to use the information about the athlete in any way you want, right? That's what everyone is already doing.
Mm-hmm.
In the applied world, especially these big sports teams, they have like whole biomechanists and a whole team just gathering data about these athletes, attempting to optimize performance. But using data about how the athlete naturally performs is different than maybe giving them specialized equipment or performance enhancing drugs. And, it's just learning more about how that athlete handles certain tasks.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's no problem with using data to optimize performance. In fact, especially at like those elite levels, like when you're talking about people who, let's call it like in track and field, right?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between first and second place is like 1/10 of a second.
Yeah.
And so what are you supposed to do for them in terms of their training if you can't make those fine-tuned adjustments? And biomechanical data is just one of those ways to kind of make those adjustments. You can take a look at other things too, physiological data, whether it be sleep or cardiorespiratory stuff. But those are just kind of the information about the person that it's like at that level, if you can't measure those things and make those subtle changes, then how are you really supposed to
you can't make up
excel?
that 10th of a second difference, right?
Yeah, so I don't think it's unfair because everybody has access to it to an extent. I mean, obviously there's going to be some organizations or teams or whatever that have more money and more staff and
the technology is out there, but do you have access to it? Are you using it?
Yeah, but I mean, to your point, it's not the same as like giving a performance enhancing drug in that sense, where you're sort of bypassing the in some cases the work that's necessary to make those changes, right? I think we talk about this a lot internally, but then with some of our customers too, that data by itself is not going to do anything for you, right? Like you have to have somebody that interprets that information and then turns it into something actionable. And so
exactly,
just collecting the data alone, I don't think is controversial in any way. I
would agree.
Yeah.
I would say this is probably one of the less controversial questions on this list for sure.
Yeah.
But we're in agreement so far. It's good.
Have you heard about this, a total tangent, but have you heard about the enhanced games that they're trying to do?
I haven't actually. So maybe I have. So
it's like an Olympic Games where they're allowing anything. Like, so, any performance enhancing drugs, any sort of methods or strategies that they want to use.
Oh, that's interesting.
That may not be, legal in the eyes of USADA or any of these other, the IOC or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see how biomechanics plays a part in that, right?
Yeah.
If that's even something that they really focus on, because, most of that I think is going to be like, what are people taking to optimize recovery or cardiovascular performance or whatever, right?
Right. I imagine those things are going to say like, all right, assume everything and anything is legal.
Right.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see. I don't know when they're planning on actually launching it. I think it was like 2025.
Okay.
So,
we might see it pretty soon.
Let's keep our eyes out for that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a fun one. We breezed through that pretty quick. Let's see, GPT. What do you got for us? So, is there a risk of overanalyzing athletes' performance, leading to analysis paralysis and decreased creativity?
This is a little bit interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like this kind of goes back to how are you interpreting the data, right? I feel like that's really the only risk to overanalyzing it is, are you analyzing it perhaps incorrectly, right? And it all comes down to whoever's looking at the data and trying to communicate it to the athlete, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to analyze someone's running performance and you notice something about, maybe this athlete has too much foot pronation on one side, just to make something really simple.
Yeah.
Do you go down this rabbit hole of like, we have to fix that, like one thing about their biomechanics, or do we just assume that this might be, something that this athlete uses, and if we try to fix it, it might decrease their performance? So I think really there, to me, is the risk of overanalyzing is who's interpreting it, like which avenue are they following?
Yeah, kind of like, do they have a question that they're answering? So like, instead of just collecting data and then sort of exploring to see if you identify any issues or deficits, it's like, okay, you've got pain, or this is a problem that we've identified within your mechanics or whatever you're doing. Let's investigate that deeper, right? So I think that sort of eliminates the risk of the paralysis by analysis. But yeah, if you're just like capturing data for the sake of capturing data, you're going to maybe find something, or you're going to like forcefully find something, that isn't necessarily there or even changeable, right? And I think the other thing that comes into play with that too is like, how much data are you collecting? And on what? I feel like I'm a big fan of the less is more approach a lot of the times when it comes to like biomechanics, and especially using our equipment. It's like, if you can really refine that data collection process and what you're actually trying to analyze, you're going to be able to actually make a more impactful, have a more impactful effect versus like, let's do it all. Let's look at EMG, force, kinematics, your cardiorespiratory rate, and then see if we can make sense of it all after the fact.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I find that is something that a lot of our customers sometimes struggle with, is they'll get all the equipment, they'll have force plates, they'll have EMG, they'll have motion capture, and then they'll just say, okay, I want to perform this test, and then figure out what it means afterwards.
Right.
And, it's really easy to fall into that when you're like a little kid in a candy store. You have all this information, you get so excited, but I absolutely agree that like less is more is sometimes better. If you go in attempting to answer a question that you have and put together the pieces of the puzzle from there, rather than like throwing all the spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, then you are at risk of finding something that maybe doesn't mean anything.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, full disclosure, we are not coaches or biomechanists or sports scientists, but
I'm speaking mostly from the conversations that we've had with our customers, and how sometimes they'll approach us and be like, what do you recommend looking at? And of course we can't advise on that. We can't tell them what to look at, but I have taken the approach of advising them to choose a few things rather than everything.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you see the people that are the most successful in these fields, especially in terms of performance, and oftentimes they're very restrictive in what they actually look at. And it's not this just let me cast a wide net and see what I can get kind of a thing. It's like, no, I'm always laser focused on this particular thing, and oftentimes that's because they've spent a long time figuring out and whittling that down to really determine like what's going to give me the best bang for my buck, so to speak.
Right.
But those are tend to be the people who have the best success kind of in this industry, are the ones that can kind of distill it down into one or two primary things that they look at. all the time. And then it's like from there, you can maybe create these little branches, you know, to sort of investigate some of these outliers or, you know, maybe more anomalous type things. So
yeah. Well, that's where having a well-designed test comes into play as well, because you tell an athlete to go run down the block, you know, they might do it differently, you know.
Every time, right?
Every single time. You tell an athlete to, like, let's say you're playing basketball and you want to look at something sports specific. You say, just run around the court the way you normally would with a basketball. What does that tell you?
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing repeatable about that scenario. Maybe some coaches might be able to understand something from that, of course. I'm not saying that type of, you know, analysis is completely useless, but that's where, you know, these repeatable tests like jump analysis and, you know, lateral shuffle and things like that have become really common, come into play too, is because now you do have these parameters that are well researched and people look at them for performance and rehabilitation purposes.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, we're, I think, and, you know, even though we're not these professionals in this space, right? I think that most of the people that we have talked to and have relationships with would definitely agree with us on these points.
Yeah.
I hope so. They'll have to listen and tell us.
I hope so. Yeah, please tell us if we're completely off base.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't stress enough that we are not authoritative when it comes to, you know, analyzing specific performance and rehab or anything like that.
We try.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. I think that's probably a full, complete answer to that question. You know, ChatGPT is not listening to us at the moment, but, you know, maybe they would feel satisfied with those answers.
Yeah.
But let's see here. Next question. So, is there a point where biomechanical enhancements could make sports unrecognizable from their original form?
We'll have to see what the enhanced Olympics is like.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. Yeah, this is an interesting one because I think that, you know, where maybe this is coming from is this idea that, like, if you like hyper fixate on the mechanics, you know, maybe it takes away from the sort of flow of movement, where people have, you know, very natural abilities that may be biomechanically disgusting, but they're wildly successful, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, you see this a lot, I would say, in like baseball pitching. You know, guys that can throw over 100 miles an hour consistently, haven't had injuries, but they go and get analyzed and compared to like the reference ranges, and, you know, they're on the ends. You know, their mechanics are not stacking up with what science says it should be, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where this is kind of coming from, is that it's like, if you turn every athlete into a robot, does the sport actually look the same, or is it just like a bunch of robots going around making every shot, you know, whatever it might be? Yeah,
that's a really interesting perspective on this one. I mean, I agree that, you know, there's not always one right way to do things, right? So if, you know, people fall too far into this category of saying, okay, this is the biomechanically sound way to perform this action.
Yeah.
And that person's not doing that, and they try to make them fit within that window. Do we end up with athletes that, you know, are able to perform at a higher capacity, or do we not? You know, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I guess I'm not 100% sure too. It's kind of you're sort of projecting here of like, if there is no sort of creativity, does that still make the sport what it is? And I mean, at the end of the day, there's sort of rules and guidelines of the sport, so it'd probably look very similar, but it definitely wouldn't be as fun, right? I mean, you know, in a lot of these scenarios and in sports, that sort of creative element that the athletes get to take is really what makes it like the most exciting part, right? It's, you know, people aren't excited about watching somebody shoot a free throw, but they're excited about watching a guy, you know, like split two defenders and jump 3 feet in the air and dunk it, right? Which is like, there's no biomechanical test that's going to be able to say whether or not he's doing that correctly or not, you know, because it's just chaos. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I would have to say no.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's a point there because I don't think it's even possible to achieve.
No, I would agree.
There's too much variability within the human body in every single person to be able to like actually put people into these cookie cutter molds of how they should be moving mechanically. So
yeah, I agree.
But yeah, we'll have to see, I guess, as time goes on, because this type of data collection and using data to sort of drive performance and rehab and all these things is definitely becoming more popular. So I guess time will tell, maybe if we start to see more robotic athletes out there and what their success rates are.
Right. I mean, that's a good point too, because we are kind of at that little tipping point where we have people that have been doing biomechanical analysis for a long time, know what they're looking for. And we have a lot of people just starting and they're trying to figure out what to look at. And, there might be a large group of people that, are very loud and say, this is the way to do it. And, it shifts how sports are analyzed from an athlete performance perspective. Who knows?
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, but I think part of the fun of sports is the chaos. So it would be a little bit disappointing if everyone turned into these robots that did everything exactly biomechanically
perfectly
correct.
every time. Yeah, I agree. So I think the next set of questions, we've covered a bit on performance enhancement and what biomechanics means in sports. But of course, the other big area is in recovery, rehab, and so using data to drive those processes. So ChatGPT came up with some fun questions for us here. First one being, how reliable is biomechanical analysis in preventing injuries, and can over-reliance on it lead to complacency in training?
Interesting.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. Interesting two-part question.
Yeah, I was going to say these are a little bit different, but we can answer both for sure.
Yeah, so I would say reliability-wise, first of all, big, sticking point there with the preventing injuries terminology, right? Because I don't necessarily know if anything is going to prevent an injury, especially when it comes to contact-based injuries, right? But maybe that's not what is being referenced here. Certainly, biomechanical analysis and implementing that in terms of the training programs and rehabilitation can help mitigate injuries, but I don't know if it would ever actually be able to prevent the injuries.
Yeah.
As far as reliability goes, I think that comes with what are you measuring, right? And that reliability is going to vary widely based off of what systems you're using, how you're using them, and what you're testing for.
Exactly. Yeah, I thought this question was interesting because it's not the biomechanical analysis that's doing the injury prevention. It's who is it interpreting the data? How well was the test performed? Which technology are you using? How is the athlete actioning any additional input you're giving them in order to prevent an injury?
Yeah.
So there's so much variability here that at any one of those points, it could just be someone does the test and say, oh, this doesn't work. But it might not necessarily be the biomechanical analysis is whatever that word is fault, but it could be how it was interpreted, how the athlete changed what they were doing to maybe prevent the injury. But as you said, with contact sports, anything could happen randomly at any time. So it would be, I think the importance would be, how is it being applied to some kind of training program that the athlete is performing?
Yeah.
But coming from an engineering background, I'm seeing the word reliable and I'm going okay, let's talk about making a reliable test, you know?
Yeah, or using a reliable parameter, right? That's proven out statistically to suggest that, okay, if you use this, it's going to give you consistent results every single time.
Yep.
And I think that's where you see the biggest variance in different people's interpretation of biomechanical analysis, right? And that's gonna have the greatest effect, I think, too, where you can get hyper focused on something that's unreliable because maybe it's easy to access, right? Maybe it's I don't know, like some handheld device or something that does all these fancy calculations and gives you this score, right? That maybe that's not truly been proven out to be reliable, and so you hyper focus on the score that it's giving you, but then you don't actually see any results coming from that. Versus another thing that is very reliable but doesn't necessarily give you any indication of what you should do next, right? Like maybe a good example of that might be like jump height, or rather even flight time specifically, right? Like really, really reliable in terms of a parameter, but like, what are you going to do with just flight time? You know, like, hey, you this was your flight time, and then like, how do we get that higher? You know, and I guess you can continue measuring that and see, but it doesn't necessarily inform the athlete or the clinician or whoever, you know, how that movement was performed or what the strategy was to achieve that flight time. So that's when you start to have to dig deeper, peel back the layers of the onion, and also where maybe the unreliability starts to kind of creep up too.
For sure. Yeah.
So
I think what's really interesting too, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but you mentioned like, you know, performing a test and coming up with a score. I think, you know, that's really the danger too, is, you know, clinicians maybe having some sort of technology that's, you know, compiling everything and then giving them a score. But then maybe they don't understand what goes into that score. Like the score could be bad for a number of different things. And so interpreting that information incorrectly is, I think, just as much of a risk, and really goes into the like who's interpreting the data sort of thing. I think I'm kind of bleeding over to the next question here that I'm looking at it, but maybe we can move to that one then.
Yeah, I guess real quick in terms of the second part of this question, as far as like over reliance leading to complacency, I don't really think so, because again, it's like the biomechanical analysis is just informing you of how you're moving potentially. It doesn't necessarily inform you on what you need to do next. And so the training element, in some cases, I would think it maybe does the opposite, right? It doesn't create complacency in training, unless I guess you're getting consistently good results, you know, maybe that's the concern. But otherwise, you know, typically you're trying to beat whatever you had previously. So it kind of motivates a lot of people in training, in rehabilitation, to correct some of those things that you know, are being displayed to them from biomechanical testing. So I've, you know, wanted to drop that point in there before we fully moved on. But
yeah, definitely. I also think that, I mean, going back to your example of jump height, right? If you're communicating to your athlete, okay, your jump height is really low, we need to get this up, and you see that the training program you're giving them is improving their jump height, you know, that should be very motivating. But vice versa, I can see, okay, maybe their jump height is improving based on the training program they're following, but their performance at the sport is not necessarily improving. So I guess that's one area that I can see, you know, maybe complacency in that, you know, you're just looking at the wrong thing, right? You're saying, okay, this training program must be working because this metric is improving. But the overall performance of the sport might not be. So
yeah, no, there's definitely, there's a lot of factors that are come into play. I think especially when you're dealing with athletes, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters in that realm is like, did we win, you know, or as an individual athlete, did I, you know, perform the way that I expect to perform, right? In terms of my stats or whatever. The stuff that happens off the court or off the field is interesting and can have an impact, but it is not really like what the athlete's job is, right? Like they're supposed to go out there and play the sport to the best of their ability, and ultimately win games or matches or whatever it is. And so, like you said, maybe their jump height's getting higher, but they, scored less or whatever it is, right? Or slower somehow or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, those kind of have to go hand in hand. And I think there is a delicate balance, and, especially for trainers that are implementing, data from biomechanical testing, they have to really understand like what that handshake looks like, and when are they sort of crossing lines, so to speak. And I think that's what's interesting too about learning more about like the sports science industry within these different organizations and sports, is you see it's generally not just like one individual who's kind of controlling the whole mechanism of like testing to training to coaching or whatever, right? It's just like it's multiple people that they're their own team that have to collaborate together and say, okay, here's the results that we're getting from the test. How do we interpret that? How do we design this program to help this person get better or perform better? And then use the coaching side of it to kind of understand more of the state of the art, let's say, about what they're doing. And so that sort of collaboration, I think, is really important. And organizations, have to really focus on who they're staffing, and making sure that they all mesh really well together. Because anytime you get a break in that chain, the person that suffers is like the athlete, right?
Exactly.
Right? Because they're getting wrong information or bad advice from somebody, right? And when those aren't synchronized, that's what I think can lead to maybe complacency in training, because they're like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So anyways, I guess that's a reasonable segue into the next one. So, and we kind of touched on this even in our previous theme, but what are the potential risks of misinterpreting biomechanical data in sports training and injury rehabilitation?
In terms of the risks, I would say the main risk in terms of misinterpreting data with regards to sports training or injury rehabilitation is that the athlete just doesn't get better. That's, really one of the main risks, right? Is you're trying to collect this information and interpret it in a way that's going to help. And maybe the athlete follows the clinician's advice on a training program to follow, or rehabilitation exercises, stretching, strengthening to a T, and nothing happens.
Sure, or worse, right? They get re-injured.
Yeah.
I think that's
which is very common even with really well-programmed rehabilitation programs.
Yeah, but I think that's something that maybe the biomechanical data can have an effect on as well, because let's say there's an asymmetry or some sort of deficit side to side, whether it be injured versus uninjured, or even just in a general evaluation. Does overtraining occur on the one side that's lower to sort of match the other one, while not increasing or training the other side as aggressively? And so like you're just trying to match the level of the other side, and then what does that potentially do once you do get there, right? Or maybe you go above that other side, so now you've recreated this asymmetry or this deficit, and potentially give yourself a risk of injury in that case. I know that's very common in like ACL reconstruction, where they're hyper focused on strengthening the musculature around the knee on the injured side, and they somewhat neglect or can neglect the uninjured side. And then at some point in time, that injured side has surpassed the uninjured side, and then something happens on the field or whatever, right? And they now have injured the contralateral limb.
I don't remember the stats on that, but I remember it being extremely highly
prevalent,
likely. You would injure your opposite ACL after an initial injury. So, all that to say, the risk of misinterpreting, you'd still, even if you don't misinterpret the data, you might still end up with re-injury. So it's really hard to say whether the risk is due to misinterpretation of data or execution or understanding of what the problem is, communication between the physical therapist or the coach that's working with the athlete to the athlete.
Yeah.
Like maybe the athlete didn't really have it straight in their head what exactly they had to do, and that's why they went all in on unilateral training on the injured limb and neglected the other one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, probably outside of that is maybe just like going all in on like one parameter or something, like over focusing on one thing. And, you know, we kind of touched on this previously, but it's like, if you're just focused on getting your jump height higher, you know, how does that, what's the overall effect on, you know, performance or rehab of that? And can that lead you down a pathway that, you know, maybe doesn't create re-injury, but it definitely isn't helping on, you know, the side of, you know, getting better holistically.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the other risk of misinterpreting it in a sense of like, here's where I'm seeing this deficit. We need to focus on getting this deficit better, you know? So, yeah, that seems like that could be another avenue for people to really go down that doesn't yield the best results in sports and injury rehab.
Yeah, if you're hyper focused on jump height and you're saying we need to improve the jump height, there are a billion different ways the athlete can execute that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, higher jump height, does this result in maybe, you know, less contact time on the ground if you're performing a drop jump from a height? And maybe that results in some, you know, deficiency in the way they're actually performing a sport because that rapid fire muscle movement hasn't been trained as well, because you're saying, okay, you just need to jump as high as possible no matter what.
Right.
So, you know, it's all about how you're communicating that information too.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's one thing that I've learned is very important when, like, you know, over the years talking with our customers that are in, you know, physical therapy or in sports performance, is like the cueing that they give to their patients or their athletes is like so important, because you can sort of be very direct with your cueing, and in a sense of saying like, you know, I need you to jump higher, right? Or you can be creative in terms of how do you give them an indirect cue to achieve the result. And like, that's sort of the practice that seems to have the best effect, because you're sort of instructing them as far as like how they should do something without actually telling them what you want to get out of them.
Right.
And then I think that gives them a different lens of kind of looking at, you know, what's actually happening in terms of that test or that athlete in terms of their performance or whatever. So, yeah, it seems like that's like an ultra important piece to this puzzle, is like, get the information, interpret it how you wish, but like how you communicate it to back down the chain is really what's going to have the most effect.
Yeah, definitely.
Successfully or unsuccessfully, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've touched on sports performance, we've touched on rehabilitation and the effect of biomechanics in both of those areas. So now ChatGPT wants us to talk about technology in biomechanics. And so I think this kind of comes into play really with like looking at the questions is like, how does biomechanics technology inform, you know, performance and maybe rehabilitation? But the first question is, should biomechanically advanced equipment like running shoes or swimsuits or swim caps or goggles or whatever be allowed in professional sports? So I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on this. I mean, I think where you see it mostly used is definitely in running. You know, it's amazing how much science goes into the construction and the design of these running shoes, you know, particularly for like distance runners, marathoners. And, you know, definitely that has played a role in the sort of expansion or trajectory of these ultra, athletes in long distance running, achieving these crazy results, whether it's the sub 2 hour marathon or, any of these achievements that have happened in, the recent years. And it's, not, of course, directly because of the shoes that they're wearing, but it definitely changes something. I mean, I don't know if you've ever put on those like professional running shoes before.
I haven't. I have seen that video that's making its way around where there's like a carbon plate in a running shoe and they just like spring it across the room.
Yeah, you compare it to just like your standard running shoe. Number one, it's like really uncomfortable to wear. It's just like a standard shoe, like a walker, right? Mm-hmm. So, but there's definitely an element to it that's like assisting the process or the mechanics that are happening while running.
It's not going to take your casual athlete and turn them into a professional, though. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's where I struggle to have a strong opinion here as well. It's like how much is it really doing? Yeah. And that specialized equipment, I mean, think triathlon. Like, those guys, it's all about the equipment they're using. Like, how aerodynamic is the bike? They have those aero bars. They have cool helmets. Yeah, they have, like, the just the aerodynamically designed. Where
everything, right? They're in wind tunnels, and they're, looking at the way that all the airflow is passing.
Exactly. The wheels, how heavy is the bike? As long as the athletes all have access to the same thing, right? I don't see a problem with it. I mean, we don't need to go back in time and say, no, this is too aero. Like, you have to go back.
We need more drag.
Everyone rides a beach cruiser.
Side note, I really want to do a triathlon with a beach cruiser.
Oh my God, it would be really difficult.
It'd be modified. We'll get into it another time.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think, like, as long as the access is there, then why shouldn't it be allowed? You know? And I don't, even in the sense of like Nike developing those shoes to do the sub 2 hour marathon. Like, I don't know if those were allowed in competition. I have no idea.
I don't know either.
Or if it was just for the purpose of like breaking this record. And maybe at this point, maybe they are allowed, or maybe there's a certain element to it. They put those guidelines in place to sort of create the fairness across the board. Mm-hmm. But again, it's like, if everybody has access to it, then why not? There's no sense, like you said, in going back in time and just like artificially putting barriers on people because they're getting too good.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I feel about it. I understand that in some cases, like, a good example, and this may not be like biomechanically advanced equipment, but it is like physics advanced in terms of baseball. Like, they use wooden bats in professional baseball instead of aluminum bats. Mm-hmm. And, the reason is because like a aluminum bat, these guys would be hitting home runs like 600 feet, 700 feet, like every time.
Yeah.
So they kind of have to put a little bit of a barrier there, but that's how it's always been in professional baseball, always wooden bats, right? So it's not like it's been exposed to where it's like, one team started using like an aluminum bat and then, won the World Series or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I think as long as everybody agrees that, okay, we're good with kind of these barriers being put on the sport and what equipment we can use, then that seems fair.
Yeah, I think it's just really cool to see how biomechanical analysis has informed product design. Yeah. It's like all of these different accessories and tools that athletes are using during their sport were developed with, more efficient biomechanics in mind. So, I mean, what's the point of researching it if you're just going to take it away?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there is the element of like the casual athlete, or I guess like youth athletics, and people sort of trying to get better or get into that elite category. Mm-hmm. And so maybe like this, fancy equipment kind of helps them feel that motivation or reach those certain levels that they want to get to.
Yeah.
but that's why they're amateurs, right?
Exactly.
If you want to be a pro, you got to sort of abide by these certain rules, which
sounds like a psychology thing at that point too. If it makes you feel better to use the $1,000 running shoes instead of the $50 running shoes, cool.
Yeah, exactly. Go for it. That's that's always something too that you hear about, like in terms of like some people just like their natural abilities, right? Regardless of what equipment they're using, like are going to always be at that pinnacle. But
you always have that guy who's like you're trying your best, right? You have all the tools, you're like giving it your absolute all. Then you have that guy who's just good at everything, no matter what. Right. So I think everyone has a that guy, I guess.
Every sport does, for sure.
Every sport has a that guy.
Exactly. They need to start putting like, heavier weights or something in like LeBron's basketball shoes or something like that.
Yeah.
Let's go the other direction, like biomechanics disadvantages.
Exactly. That'd be fun. Let's go opposite. So we have the enhanced Olympics.
Yeah.
Let's go the
unenhanced.
Yeah,
exactly.
Olympics.
We're going the other direction.
Yeah.
See how raw can you actually get if you're being, held down by something.
Yeah.
I don't think that'll take off. I don't think people will be interested.
I don't think so.
So kind of coming up on our last question here. We've talked about a lot of this stuff in terms of like, what does biomechanics offer in terms of optimization? Is it fair to use data? How should it be used? What are the risks of using it? But we have a fun question, a little bit more of a lighthearted one, that is, if you could apply biomechanics to make one everyday task ridiculously easy, what task would it be?
Yeah, full disclosure, we were given these questions ahead of time.
Oh, so you've been thinking about this for
I've been trying
hours.
to think about this. I've been trying really hard to think about this. And I'm like, what is the thing that I would want to just be made easier?
Sure.
Right? And I really struggled. But I mean, it comes down to things that aren't really biomechanical every time I thought about it, right? I'm like, man, I'd really like driving to the office every day to be easier somehow. It's not like I'm in pain. It just takes a long time. Exactly. Like there's no biomechanical anything that I can do.
Unless you can figure out how to fly.
Yeah. I mean, that would be something interesting. I could learn how to fly. Yeah. What's the biomechanics of that?
I don't know. I think there's more to it.
Yeah. So I feel like I've let everyone down, but I've like really just struggled to find anything here aside from like, thinking about moving around the kitchen. Like Sure. If I could have something to like make it easier to raise my arm above my head and get something off of the top shelf. Yeah. But that would mean using a tool, right? Not necessarily me. I can't make my arm longer.
No, but maybe that's part of it, right? Is like biomechanics. The application of biomechanics doesn't necessarily mean like you're making an effect on your physical body.
Yeah.
But is it using a tool, a piece of equipment
Sure.
to maybe make that easier? So in your case, what you mentioned sounds like you need an exoskeleton.
Yeah, maybe.
To use around the kitchen to put things up into high cabinets.
Yeah, I'm just, it's a short person problem,
Yeah, or we just get you one of those claws.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just need a claw everywhere. Get stuff from behind the couch, get stuff from up there.
Yeah, you'll be unstoppable.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about this one and thinking about everyday tasks that, are they challenging biomechanically? I don't know.
Yeah.
But certainly one that comes to mind is, having to pick my 2-year-old up and like basically run around with him up above my head, because he wants to pretend that he's an airplane or something like that. So as an everyday task, I would say that's one that I would want to try to figure out, whether it's with an exoskeleton. Maybe, I just got to have a better lifting technique with getting it up there so that, one day I don't, tweak my neck or something like that.
Like get some sensors on you, have you perform like a squat with like an overhead press movement and check your mobility, check how fast you can complete the movement,
Exactly.
check which muscles you're using.
We'll do a NIOSH analysis with the lifting equation, and
Exactly.
I got to tell them, I'll say, hey man, this isn't a safe lifting limit. So
right.
sorry, I'm just keeping up with what the standards say.
Yeah.
No more plane rides for you.
Yeah, listen to the biomechanics gods.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't make the.
There's no room for interpretation.
I don't make the rules here. I just follow them. Okay.
Yeah.
He'll understand.
I'm sure.
Well, that's it. I think that we made our way through these questions from ChatGPT. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed this. I think the questions. It's interesting to think about where ChatGPT gets these from. So maybe there's somebody else out there that's already answered some of these. But
I know, right?
We'll have to see how we stack up. But
yeah. I mean, I like this kind of, exploring different topics approach. Maybe we can figure out how to do something like this again. Just ask ChatGPT more questions.
We will. We'll do it for sure. But I guess that's it for this one. And so thanks everybody for joining us. And be sure to follow us on all of our social media pages at Neuraxon USA. And we will see you next time.